Jesus is more. Jesus is more. Jesus is more. Jesus is more. Ooh, yeah. Jesus is more than wonderful. And he's more than beautiful. That's why we're more than conquerors. More than conquerors. Everybody wants a hero. Everybody needs a friend. A shoulder to lean on. Everybody needs a helping hand. Well, you ought to try Jesus. Said he's just a prayer away. See, he can make your burdens light up, turn your midnight into day. Yeah. He's so much more than a healer. When you're feeling kind of down, said he's more than able. I know he can turn your life around. Why we're more. It's only Jesus. More than a miracle. He changed my life. Don't you know he made it right? Now I can do all things. Jesus who strengthens me.
Whatever you may go through in life, you can make it if you try. Just remember, the power's not in you, but it's all in Jesus Christ. He can fight your every battle, oh Lord. He can win the fight. Just call him when you need a friend. Be alone and noon and night. Oh, there ain't no secret what my God can do. 'Cause what he's done for others, I know he can do the same. See, there's been times in my life when I felt like giving up, but let me tell you what he did for me. See, he worked a miracle in my life, and he took away all my pain and made it right. Now I'm a living witness to the goodness of the Lord. Hey, listen now.
If you need a shoulder to lean on, if you need a shelter in your time of storm, if you need a friend when you're going through, he will never leave you, never will forsake you. Yeah. If you need a water when you're thirsty, if you need strength for your journey, even in the midst of the fire, he's my provider. Ain't nobody higher. I don't care what you might be going through in your life right now. I want you to know that God is more than any problem you have.
You may be sick, but he's more. You may be down and you just can't afford it. He's more.
He'll make a way
Out of no way, he has all the power.
Tell me
Where
where
is
is your face? You see, it was God who made the sun to rise. It was God who put
There we go. Pardon me, I didn't have my microphone on. And thank you so much for informing me that I was talking, but I couldn't be heard because I didn't have my mic on. So let's begin again. Beloved, we have embarked on a series of studies entitled A Pilgrimage Through Proverbs. This pilgrimage through Proverbs has yielded much to us in terms of study and learning. This study for me has been most interesting, intriguing, and most instructive because the wise man Solomon takes us through three phenomenal phases as we study and read the book of Proverbs. If you look at it closely, the book called the Bible, and the book called Proverbs is segmented in three phenomenal phases. Three phenomenal phases. I repeat this constantly because it's important to appreciate and fully understand the book called Proverbs. The first phenomenal phase that the wise man Solomon takes us through is the deals primarily with moral issues. The first phenomenal phase that the wise man Solomon takes us through deals primarily with moral issues. Now, beloved, listen, when we talk about moral issues, we are always talking about that which is right and that which is wrong, that which is good, that which is bad, that which is evil, and that which is righteous, that which is wretched. When we talk about moral issues, Solomon contrasts with to us and with us good and evil. He compares and contrasts good with evil, wretchedness with righteousness, and he always leads and points to the way of wisdom. Wisdom is always better, it's always superior, if you will, in the book of Proverbs, to foolishness and folly. And foolishness and folly will lead to death. The words of wisdom always lead us to life. So the wise man Solomon, in this first phenomenal phase of the book of Proverbs, and that's chapters 1 through 9. When we go through chapters 1 through 9, we are dealing primarily with moral issues. And then the wise man Solomon transitions from moral issues to miscellaneous issues. Chapters 10 through 19 deal primarily with miscellaneous issues. When we speak of the word miscellaneous, we are always defining and describing a mix or a mixture, if you will, a variety of issues. The wise man Solomon deals with a variety of issues in the miscellaneous section in the phenomenal phase of the book of Proverbs. The last and final phase that the wise man Solomon takes us to and takes us through deals primarily with monarchical issues. Monarchical issues. Now, listen to me carefully. Embedded in the word monarchical is the word monarch. Embedded in the word monarch is the word mono, and mono is Latin for one. So when we talk about monarchical issues, when we talk about monarchs, we're talking about mono, one ruler, or one who rules. The wise man Solomon has a word for leaders and those who occupy the position of leadership. The wise man Solomon takes us through this phenomenal phase as we go to chapter 26. We have studied sagaciously, we have studied 26 chapters in the book of Proverbs, and it has yielded much knowledge and wisdom to us as we study. My prayer for you is that you're getting as much out of this study as I'm getting out of this study, because these life-changing words are important to us if we're desirous of making heaven our home. Now, beloved, we're in the 26th chapter of the book of Proverbs. I believe we completed our study on last week in verse number 12, which places us at the doorstep of verse number 13. We're in the 26th chapter of the book of Proverbs, commencing with verse number 13. Now, for the sake of review, let's remember what we have studied so we can better appreciate what we will study. As we look at the 26th chapter of the book of Proverbs, starting with verse number 1, that's in the 25th chapter. It begins in the 25th chapter. The outline that Solomon lays out begins in the 25th chapter and ends in the 26th chapter of the book of Proverbs. But he begins this outline with a stern warning, and it begins in chapter 25. Don't miss this. This outline begins in chapter 25, commencing with verses 1 through 7. This stern warning Solomon gives to us is intended for his sons and his subjects. Beginning with chapter 25, the beginning verses, initial verses, verses 1 through 7 in particular, he gives us a stern warning. Solomon says to his sons and his subjects, beware. He tells them to beware, be aware of sovereigns, That's another word for leaders, for those who occupy national positions of leadership. Solomon says that we need to beware of our national leaders. Always be on the lookout towards our national leaders, our sovereigns, if you will. Verses 1 through 7 in chapter 25 warns us to beware of sovereigns. Beware of sovereigns. Now, in chapter 25, picking up in verse number 8, Solomon transitions from warning us about our sovereigns to tell us to beware and be aware of sinners. He says you always have to be on the lookout for sinners, That's, of course, in chapter 25, going all the way to verse number 12 in Proverbs chapter 26. So that is a long run from Solomon in chapter 12, chapter 26, and it goes all the way to verse number 12, all the way from chapter 25. So he tells us first to beware of sovereigns, then he tells us to beware of sinners, and then he transitions once more, beginning with verse number 13 in chapter 26. He's getting ready to start a new outline. Remember, he's warning us against sovereigns, he's warning us against sinners, but in verse 13, he transitions from warning us about sinners to warn us about sluggards, That's where we will formally begin our study for this evening in chapter 26, verse number 13. Let me give you a little definition and description of this word sluggard, so we'll be on the same page when I mention the word sluggard. Now, Please remember that the word sluggard is an old archaic English word for our contemporary English word lazy. When you talk about a sluggard, you're talking about somebody who is lazy, someone who is primarily idle, a person who is lazy because they always remain idle, if you will. The word sluggard gives us our English word sluggish. And a sluggish person is an idle person. It's also associated with a slow moving person, a slow moving person. So a sluggard can be defined as an idle person, a slow moving person, or a lazy person. Notice, if you will, Solomon returns to one of his most frequent discussed topics, and that is of the sluggard, of the lazy person, if you will. Solomon seems to take um, detailed a detailed look, a four-dimensional look at the sluggard, and his observation on the sluggard, about the sluggard, is very interesting, intriguing, and most instructive. So if I were you, I would get my pen, I would get my paper, and write these detailed observations down, because he takes his time, he goes out of his way to describe and define for us the sluggard, the lazy person, the idle person, the person who is slow moving, if you will. Now, look at verse number 13 in the book of Proverbs. We're looking now at Proverbs chapter 26, verse number 13 in particular. I'll give you time to get there. Proverbs chapter 26, verse number 13. Look closely, if you will, at verse 13. The wise man Solomon says, "The slothful man, the sluggish man saith, there is a lion in the way, a lion is in the streets." Listen at Solomon. Solomon is telling us in no uncertain terms what the sluggard says. Write that down, beloved. That's what verse 13 is all about. Solomon is telling us in detail what the sluggard says. He says that the sluggard says, "The slothful man saith, there is a lion in the way." There is a lion in the streets. There's a lion in the street. So in verse number 1, the wise man Solomon shares with us what the sluggard says, what the lazy man says. The lazy man says there is a lion in the way. There's a lion in the streets. Now, verse number 14 tells us where the sluggard stays, where the sluggard stays. Verse number 15 tells us the sluggard, why the sluggard starves. He explains to us why a sluggard will ultimately starve. And then he closes his observation in verse number 16 and shares with us whom the sluggard scorns. Who the sluggard scorns. Now let's go back to verse 13 and unpack these golden nuggets of truth as the wise man shares with us in verse 13 what the sluggard says. What the sluggard says. I believe, with all sincerity, that Solomon engages in what is called, grammatically called hyperbole. Hyperbole. Hyperbole is an extreme exaggeration. He uses an extreme exaggeration to prove a point. He uses oftentimes humor to drive home his point. Also uses extreme exaggerations to drive home the point about the sluggard. Um, so the the wise man Solomon uses hyperbole, if you will, to express to us the nature of uh, hyperbole to describe the nature of a sluggard, of a lazy person, a slow moving person, if you will. I believe Solomon is trying to go out of his way to tell us in no uncertain terms that any excuse will do when a lazy person doesn't want to do something. If they don't want to do something, they come up with these grandiose excuses of why it can't be done. In this text, Solomon says that the sluggard says there's a lion in the way. There is a lion lying in the streets waiting for me to come out so I'll be devoured. So I can't do what I need to do because there's a lion in the way. There's a lion in the streets. Any uh, in no uncertain terms. So here we see that for the sluggard, any excuse will do if a lazy person doesn't want to work, if a lazy person doesn't want to labor at any point. He, he or she, let me give you, let me put a window here so you can see what I'm talking about in modern day terms. This is the person, Solomon is describing the person who will call in to their workplace and say, I can't get my car started, so I won't be at work today. Now, it's not that their car is inoperable. It's not that their car won't start. It's that they just don't want to go to work. So any excuse will do when you don't want to do what you have to do when you have to do it. So let me give you another example of any excuse will do. It's been snowing, and my driveway is covered with snow, and I can't get out. Therefore, I won't be in today. Any excuse will do. That's what Solomon is trying to show us. That any excuse will do um, when we um, want to neglect our duty or what we are supposed to do or supposed to be doing. This kind of person will say anything to get out of doing what they don't want to do. Um, if they want to get out of doing what they don't want to do, any excuse will do. Now, this tall tale that's told to us in verse number 13 shows us how dedicated the lazy person is to avoid work. That's what Solomon's trying to teach us in this particular text. So he shares with us in verse number 13 what the sluggard says or what a lazy person will use as an excuse to not do what they should be doing. Now, that's verse number 13. Let's look closely now at verse number 14. As the door turneth upon his hinges, so doth the slothful man, the sluggish man, the sluggard, if you will, lies upon his bed. Listen to Solomon. As the door turneth upon his hinges, so doth the slothful upon his bed. I've thoroughly enjoyed this study. The wise man Solomon is so practical here in regard to everyday um, life and everyday living. In verse number 14, Solomon says, "As the door turneth upon his hinges, so does the sluggard upon his bed." Notice, if you will, here something in particular. I want you to notice very carefully that a door swings, a door moves this way, and it will move that way, but it doesn't go anywhere. It's just like being in a rocking chair. It'll give you something to do, but you ain't going nowhere. The wise man Solomon says, just like the door turneth upon its hinges and goes nowhere, so the sluggard, the lazy person, the slow moving person toss and turns in their bed and refuse to go anywhere or do anything. I love this from the wise man Solomon. He's already given us two examples of what the uh, what the sluggard says and where the sluggard stays. He stays in his bed to avoid work, to avoid labor, if you will, and will go to any extent. He will say anything. He will remain in his bed, do nothing, go nowhere, and as the door turns upon his hinges, so will the sluggard toss and turn in his bed and refuse to do nothing and to go anywhere. Even when he can manage to drag himself out of the bed, listen, he aimlessly um, um, gets up and he refuses to go anywhere or to do anything. Why? Because he's lazy. He's a sluggard. He's sluggish. He's slow moving and will do anything to avoid work. Listen to the wise man Solomon. He already shares with us the first dimension that he shares with us about the sluggard. He tells us what a sluggard says in verse number 13. Then in number 14, he shares with us where the sluggard stays. Where the sluggard stays. He stays in his bed, tossing and turning, moving aimlessly to do nothing and to go nowhere. He remains in his bed. That's where the sluggard stays. So in verse number 14, the wise man Solomon goes out of his way to share with us where a sluggard stays. He stays in bed. Why? Because he's lazy. And he shares with us in verse 13 what the sluggard says. Any excuse will do for a sluggard when he doesn't want to do what he's supposed to be doing. So the wise man Solomon transitions from verses 13 and 14 to verse number 15. How am I doing, church? Listen at verse number 15 in the book of Proverbs. The chapter is 26, and of course the verse is number 15. 26:15. Listen at Solomon. Solomon says, "The slothful man, the sluggard, hideth his hand in his bosom. It grieveth him to bring it out again to his mouth." Again, the wise man Solomon is using hyperbole. He's using hyperbole to share with us the fact that he uses extreme exaggerations to drive home the point about the sluggard. In verse number 15, he says, "The slothful hideth his hand in his bosom, and it grieves him to take it out and to put it to his mouth." To put it to his mouth. here, I believe um, the wise man Solomon is trying to share with us not only what the sluggard says or where the sluggard stays. In this particular verse, verse number 15, why the sluggard starves. Why will the sluggard starve? That's what the wise man is telling us here in verse number 15. Note, moreover, why the sluggard starves. The sluggard starves. Here, Solomon uses what I call sarcastic hyperbole. He's being sarcastic in his tone, and this particular verse is tailored to teach us that a sluggard, a lazy person, a slow moving person, an idle person will ultimately starve because they're so lazy that it grieves them, it causes them great discomfort to take their hand from their bosom to be able to put something in their mouth, in their mouth. In other words, a lazy person, a real lazy person, a real sluggard, is really uh, uh, too lazy to feed themselves, to feed themselves. They lack the energy, they lack the initiative, if you will, to feed themselves. The lazy person is so profoundly lazy that they won't even uh, take care of their personal needs. That's what Solomon is trying to tell us. He's trying to tell us that the lazy person, the slow moving person, the sluggish person, the sluggard, the lazy can become so lazy that they cannot take care of their personal needs. Now, finally, in verse number 16, Solomon winds up this outline about the sluggard, if you will, in verse number 16. We note in verse number 16 these words. The wise man Solomon says in chapter 26, verse number 16, the sluggard is wiser in his own conceit than 7 men that can render a reason. Now, here, Solomon, we need to break down what Solomon is truly saying to us in these last and evil days in verse number 16. Now, Solomon in verse 16, in the closing verse of this particular outline about the sluggard, the wise man Solomon is telling us whom the sluggard scorns. Whom the sluggard scorns. Now, this word scorn is not a word that we particularly use in modern day speech, but it is a word that defines and describes a person who openly disrespects something or someone. When you scorn someone, you are showing disrespect for something or someone. It also means to look down upon. It also means to turn away from due to the lack of respect. Due to the lack of respect. So here Solomon shares with us whom the sluggard scorns. In other words, the sluggard, in the eyes of Solomon, is the original Mr. and Mrs. Know It All. In their own eyes, they know it all. But he's far too lazy. She's far too lazy to study. Far too lazy to study, to gain knowledge and wisdom. But the sluggard thinks he still knows it all. He's too lazy to study, too lazy to perform the act of studying, and still thinks with his conceited self, or her conceited self, if you will, take your pick. um, he won't study, but still thinks he or she knows it all. Um, um, Here, Solomon is telling us in no uncertain terms that the person who is too lazy to study and still believe within the confines of their own hearts that they know it all, they know much without study, more than those know, who do know more than the sluggard knows. He's so conceited, she's so conceited, they refuse to study, but they still think they know it all, and they think they know more than those who do know more. This is what Solomon is trying to share with us. He paints the picture of a conceited person who's lazy, refuses to study, but think they know it all, and they think they know more than those who do know more. That's what verse 16 is trying to share with us. The lazy person here, as defined and described in verse number 16, the lazy person lacks energy and initiative in and of themselves, and yet considers themselves to be smarter than those who know. Here, Solomon says, than 7 men who um, considers the matter. The 7 men. Now, what Solomon is doing here, he's leaving sarcasm and starts with symbolism. The number 7 is significant in this verse because the number 7 means perfection. The number 7 means abundance. The number 7 here also means a multitude. So when Solomon uses the number 7, he's not talking about it numerically. He's talking about the number 7 symbolically. He's talking about perfection. He's talking about abundance. He's talking about a multitude, not just 7 men or women, but a multitude of men or women. In the eyes of the sluggard, he looks at the world through conceited eyes. Conceited eyes. The eyes of the sluggard, in his own eyes, he or she knows more than a multitude of people who are wiser than the sluggard, who knows more than the sluggard. But in their own eyes, they know more than those who know more. And they refuse to study to verify their information or whatever they're talking about, but yet they think they are wiser than the wisest among us. And they think they know more than those who are around them. So therefore, the wise man Solomon is telling us in no uncertain terms who the sluggard scorns, who he disrespects, who he look or she looks down upon, who or he or she that they turn away from. The wise man Solomon says, in no uncertain terms, that the sluggard, he tells us what the sluggard says in verse number 13. He tells us where the sluggard stays in verse 14, and why the sluggard starves in verse 15, and then shares with us whom the sluggard scorns, disrespects, turn away from, in verse number 16. Verse number 16. Now, as we look at verse 16 in transition from verse 16 to verse number 17, in which he now says, beware. Remember, all of these outlines begin with a stern warning to the sons of Solomon and the subjects of Solomon. He's opening these pages with a stern warning. And what's the stern warning? He's telling them to beware. He's telling them to be aware, if you will, not only of sovereigns, not only of sinners, not only of sluggards, but now he's telling us to beware and be aware of the dangers of self-importance. That's a dangerous place to be when you feel you're more important than you really are. So now Solomon's focus is on self-importance. Solomon once again transitions from verse 16 to verse number 17. Remember, verses 13 through 16, he's warning us against the sluggard. But now in verse 17, he's going to warn us against those who feel a sense of self-importance. Self-importance. Let's read verse number 17, and let's look at those who feel a sense of self-importance, and they feel that they're more important than they really are. They're more relevant than they really are. Look at verse 17. He that passeth by and meddleth with strife belongeth not to him, is like one that taketh a dog by his ears. Now here, Solomon is not describing somebody who has a dog and playfully plays with the ears of the dog. No, he's talking about actually pulling and tugging on the ears of a dog. Now, a dog doesn't have to be ferocious to bite you when you start pulling on his ears. All you have to do is pull on their ears. And let me just share with you that there's a better way to move a dog than to move a dog by pulling and tugging on their ears. Because I'm not sure that the dog would take to that kind of treatment kindly. Number one, that's just common sense. But what Solomon is trying to tell us is the person that gets involved in stuff that's not really their business is worse than pulling on a dog's ears. Pulling and tugging on a dog's ears. That's hazardous, that's dangerous, that's inconsiderate, and it could cause you to bodily harm if you try to pull a dog by and tug on a dog's ears. That's what Solomon is saying. You're just as stupid, you're just as foolish as one who pulls and tugs on a dog's ear. Now, verse 17, once again, is wrapped in self-importance. A person who feels they're more important than they really are. Now, when Solomon talks about in verse number 17, in other words, the meddler is asking for trouble. That's all Solomon is saying. You're asking for trouble when you get involved in somebody else's business that's not your own, but you meddle in it, you get involved in it as if it is your own. You're worse than a person pulling and tugging on the ears of a dog. That's what Solomon says. It's amazing to me. Really, it's amazing to me how irresistible it is for some people to get involved in somebody else's stuff. And it has nothing, absolutely, positively nothing to do with you, but you feel it's your ministry to get involved and meddle in other people's business. You'll be surprised how many people find it irresistible to get involved in your stuff, and it has nothing to do with their stuff, but they treat it as if they are treated as if it's their stuff. I'm sure you've met people like that joy and make it their personal ministry to get involved in other people's affairs. And it has nothing to do with them. I'm sure you can pinpoint people in your life that you come across that find it um, irresistible to get involved in other people's affairs, to get involved in a quarrel, if you will, or get involved in a misunderstanding, if you will, that doesn't belong to them, has nothing, absolutely nothing to do with them. Now, you look at the word metal, metalith, in verse number 17. That's a old Hebrew word. It's the translation metalith, um, is defining and describing for us a Hebrew word that paints the picture of one getting excited, one getting angry, uh, if you will. It means one who gets excited, one who gets angry over the affairs of another. That's what that word metalith means. It means that you get so worked up that you think it's your ministry to get involved in somebody else's affairs and to treat it as if it is your own affair, if you will. Solomon says, you are stupid. It's just stupid. It's foolish to get involved in something that does not uh, um, refer to you, relate to you, if you will, and you get involved as if it does directly affect you. Solomon says that's just like taking and pulling and yanking on the ears of a ferocious dog, if you will, um, and to get involved in somebody else's affairs that does not affect you directly. Am I making sense here? That's what Solomon is saying to us. Um, that it's foolish, it's dangerous, it's hazardous to get involved in other people's affairs, especially when those affairs don't directly affect you. You are like pulling a dog, tugging on a dog's ears, if you will. Now, listen, I can say without a shadow of a doubt, once one does pull on and tug on the ears uh, of a dog, you can look for the dog to retaliate. Oftentimes, when two people are arguing, two people have a spat, if you will, or a quarrel, if you will, you get involved. 9 out of 10, those two will stop fighting and turn on you. And that's what I believe Solomon is trying to tell us. It's like pulling and tugging on the ears of a dog. They'll stop fighting and turn on you because you're getting involved in something and with someone that does not directly affect you. In matter of fact, let me just put it like this: it's none of your business. And yet you make it your business to get involved in something that does not directly involve you or affect you, if you will. So Solomon exposes, in my mind, in starting with verse number 17, Solomon exposes the man who tries to stop something. Now, I believe the man who's trying to stop something is the wise man Solomon. He's trying to stop us from getting involved in stuff that doesn't involve us. Stop meddling in other people's business if it's not directly affecting your business. That's what Solomon is trying to tell us in verse number 17. He's trying to stop us from doing something. There's a much better way um, to uh, to um, to move a dog than taking a dog by his ears and tugging on his ears, if you will, or in order for them to do something, the dog to do something. The last thing you want to do, even the wise, even the strong man Samson, uh, he didn't pull the foxes by their ears. He knew that that would only infuriate them. He pulled them by their tails. And Solomon says, "You are, uh, uh, you will find yourself in the place and in the position of um, uh, danger, a hazardous situation, a dangerous situation, because getting involved in other people's business is worse than pulling and tugging on a dog's ears. A dog's ears. So in verse number 17, the wise man Solomon exposes to us the man who tries to stop something. What is the something he's trying to stop here? I believe Solomon is trying to stop us by warning us to beware, be aware of getting involved in other people's business that doesn't directly affect us or have something to do with us. Am I making myself clear here? That's in verse number 17. God, I love your word. Now in verse 18, he shares with us people who try to stir something up. He now transitions from being the man who's trying to stop us, but now he exposes people who try to stir things up. Do you know people like that who, whenever they come around, if they come into a room that you're in, seems like a cloud follows them into the room, and nothing but rain showers down upon them, because if the sun was shining before they came in, be clouds up the moment they come in to a particular room, because you know they're there for no good reason, but they are there to stir things up. That's what Solomon is defining and describing for us here in verse number 18. He says, there are people who only live to stir things up. Look at verse number 18, if you will. As a madman who casteth firebrands, arrows, and death. That person is being described in verse number 18. Now, here in verse number 18, he uses adjectives to define and describe a person who stir things up. They stir things up. Now, here I believe Solomon exposes the man who is full of guile, full of guile. Now, let me define for you what I mean by the word guile. Now, the Bible says that when Jesus spoke, no guile could be found in his mouth. No guile. It uses the old archaic phrase guile. Now, the question becomes, what is guile? What do you mean by guile, brother preacher, when you say the man full of guile? Well, guile is an old archaic word that defines and describes for us a sneaky person. You ever met a sneaky person? A person who sneaks around full of mischief and wretchedness, if you will. He's defining and describing for us a person of guile is a sneaky person, a deceitful person, a sly person, a wicked person. That's what guile means. It means sneaky, it means sly, it means wicked, it means deceitful. A person who will try to deceive you, purposely deceive you. They make you think they're one way when in actuality they're really another way. So they want to deceive you to get something from you. That's a person of guile. That's a person who is sneaky. That's the person who is deceitful. That's the person that's sly. That's the person that is wicked. Is wicked. Um, they are people who purposely trick people to make them think one thing when they know deep in their hearts they are another thing. So here, the wise man Solomon shares with us the man or woman full of guile, full of guile. It begins in verse number 18 as a madman who casteth firebrands, arrows, and death. So is the man that deceiveth his neighbor and saith, am not I in sport? Now, I really need to unpack this text because once you fully understand and appreciate what Solomon is saying, it really drives home the fact that there are people in the world today who are full of guile. Teach, Pastor, I'm doing the best I can. Listen to me carefully. There are people in the world that are full of guile. They're sneaky, they're sly, they're wretched, they're deceitful, they're tricksters, and Solomon wants us to beware. He wants us to be aware of people who are full of guile. Solomon gives us, in verse number 19, he shares with us, he exposes to us the person full of guile. Now, in verse 19, he gives us a portrait of a person full of guile. Verse 19 gives us a picture perfect look at the portrait of a person full of guile. Verse 19 gives us a portrait of the person full of guile. Verse number 19, verse number 18 gives us a portrait. I'm sorry. Verse number 18 gives us a portrait of the person full of guile. And verse 19 gives us the pretense of a person full of guile. Now, pretense here, as I'm using it in our outline for tonight, it's a dishonest person. A person that's full of pretense, full of guile, is a dishonest person. And normally, when this kind of person is caught, when this kind of person is confronted with their deeds and their actions, then they write it off by saying, "Oh, I was just kidding. I was just playing. It was just a joke. I didn't mean it. I was just pretending." That's the way a pretentious person operates. When they're confronted, when they are caught, if you will, they play it off as if it's a joke, as if they were pretending that they were just kidding. Man, I was just kidding when I tried to take your head off. I was just playing, man. That's when they are caught. That's when they're pretentious, and they are caught and confronted with their deeds. So what the wise man Solomon gives us the portrait of the person of guile in verse 18, and then in verse 19 he shows us the pretense. Now, a pretentious person is a person who is dishonest to the core. They don't mean right. They don't mean you any good. They are dishonest in their deeds and in their actions. And remember, when they are caught, when they are confronted with their deed, what they did, then he plays it off. He said, "I was just playing. I was just pretending. I was just kidding. I was just joking." So Solomon says, beware of the person that is full of guile. And he even gives us a portrait of a person full of guile in verse 18, and then show us the pretense of a person full of guile in verse number 19. Now, I need to share with you before we close, I need to share with you that a pretentious person, a person full of guile, a first person full of pretense, normally is responsible for the ruin of many people. That's what Solomon is trying to tell us in verse number 18. And it normally and usually ends in death for other people. But when he or she is caught or confronted with their deeds, they say, it was just a joke. I was just kidding. That's in verse number 19. That's what verse 19 means when it says, so is the man that deceiveth his neighbor, and when he's caught, when he's confronted, am not I in sport? Am I not just kidding? Am I not just playing? That's what Solomon is trying to tell us. That's why we need to beware. We need to be aware, and we need to understand and appreciate the portrait of a person full of guile, and we also need, in no uncertain terms, to know the pretense of a person full of guile. Now, that's verses 18 and 19. Now, watch Solomon as he transitions. And when I use the word transition, I use it often in our study on the book of Proverbs. It means to stop talking about one thing to start talking about another thing. That's what it means to transition. It means to stop and to start. It means to stop talking about one thing in order to start talking about another thing. So here Solomon transitions from verses 18 and 19 to verses 20 through 22, because he stops talking about a man or woman full of guile. He now talks about a man or woman full of gossip, Guile is just as bad as gossip, and gossip is just as bad as guile. That is a man who likes to stir things up. People who love to gossip. Um, um, these are persons and people who love to stir things up. That's the only reason why they gossip. That's the only pleasure they get from gossiping, because the results is that a gossiping person loves to stir things up. But that's not how the wise man feels in this text. He tells us to beware, be aware of people who are full of guile and people who are full of gossip. I try to stay away from gossiping people. Nothing irritates me more than to hear gossip, and that's all it is. It's not bathed in truth. It doesn't have to be true to be gossip. And normally, when people gossip, there is a tiny inchy, a speck of truth. And the most dangerous lie is the lie that has truth in it, but falsehood wrapped around it. Yeah, falsehood wrapped around it. The most dangerous lie is the lie that has truth in it. At the base of it, there is some truth there, but it's based upon falsehood. You want to confront a dangerous lie. The more truth that's in the lie makes it that more dangerous, that much more dangerous in my estimation. And the person who gossips is primarily stirring things up. I see my time is getting away from me. And in verse 23, I'm going to close in verse 23. Remember that in verses 18 and 19, the wise man Solomon exposes us to the man or to the woman that's full of guile. verses 18 and 19. He shows us the portrait of a person full of guile and the pretense of a person full of guile. Then he transitions to verses 20 and 22 and exposes us to the man full of gossip. This is the person, this is the man, this is the woman that love to stir things up, primarily stir up trouble. This is the person that stirs up trouble. Solomon shares with us in verse 20, the strife he causes. Look at verse number 20. He shows us the person that's full of gossip, the strife they cause. Look at verse 20. Where no wood is, there the fire goeth out. So where there is no talebearer, the strife will cease. The strife will stop. In other words, look at the strife the person full of gossip causes. They cause a strife. But once you remove the wood, the fire will go out. But once you remove the talebearer from your presence, then the strife will end because the source of the gossip would have been removed. So the wise man Solomon says, beware of people whose life mission, whose ministry is to stir up trouble. And that's the person full of guile and the person full of gossip. The person full of gossip. Then in verse number 22, he says, look at the sorrow they cause. Now they cause strife in verse number 20, but in verse number 22, look at the sorrow they cause. The words of a talebearer are as wounds, and they go down into the innermost parts of the belly. It bothers you right in your gut. It goes down to your innermost parts and just bubbles over, if you will. When you are being, when your heart is being overwhelmed by an outside source, it goes down into your innermost parts, if you will. Deep sorrow causes us much discomfort. That's what Solomon is trying to tell us, and it goes down to your stomach. Some people refuse to eat. It affects your stomach. Some people refuse to eat at all when they are enduring great sadness and sorrow. Some people overeat, but it goes down and affects the stomach area, and depending upon it affects your appetite even. That's what Solomon is trying to tell us when it says it goes down to the innermost part of your belly. It affects your appetite. Sorrow, sadness, grief, it all affects our appetite. Some people refuse to eat, and others tend to deal with stress and sorrow by overeating. But what Solomon is trying to show us and tell us is it affects the stomach area, and it affects ultimately our appetite. Now, Solomon is about to close this outline. He exposes first the person of guile, then he exposes the person of gossip, then he exposes the person of gall, G-A-L-L, gall. Now, when I talk about gall, I'm describing the person who finds it easy to take certain liberties with you. By taking certain liberties, they do things and say things in your presence that you might not particularly care for or like. It does not matter to a person of God because they take liberties that you have not extended to them. It describes the trait of being insensitive, if you will. It also describes the trait of being rude or to show ill will towards another. I want you to understand that there are three people Solomon tells us to beware of. Beware of the person of Gaul, verses 18 and 19. Beware of Guile. Beware of the person of Guile in verses 18 and 19. Beware of the person of gossip, verses 20 through 22. And in verse 23, he says, beware of the person of Gaul, people who are rude and insensitive and take liberties that you have not extended to them. The wise man Solomon says, beware and be aware. We've covered much today, and I'm just thankful to God for the opportunity to study with you verses 13 through 22 for tonight. And I just want to share with you before we close that I want to commend Sister Alex Jackson for referring a proposal to myself and the elders in regard to a coat giveaway, a winter coat giveaway. We've discussed it among ourselves, and we think it's an excellent idea. And we want to thank you, Sister Jackson, for coming up with this idea with the coming holiday season. We're asking, as a result, that the church considers, when you do your Christmas shopping, that you purchase a new coat, or provide the resources that we can get a new coat for someone who needs a coat with the coming winter season. Certainly, the Bible says that it's more blessed to give than it is to receive. And so we're asking each and every faithful member of this church to consider buying a new coat. We are trying to collect enough to give away 100 new coats to those who need a new coat for the coming winter months. Now listen to me carefully. We can begin this benevolent drive this Sunday by bringing to the building, when you come, starting this Sunday. We only have 2 weeks before we begin our drive in earnest. We're going to start giving away coats the first Saturday in December here at the building, and we are asking our young people to get involved in this most wholesome and Christian act of collecting coats for children and for adults alike for the winter months. And we'll be giving them away in earnest. We're going to start with Harvey, and then to anybody who is in need of a coat. But we want to primarily take care of our community here in Harvey. So we're asking Sunday morning that you bring a coat, or see to it that you can drop it off here at the church, and we'll keep those coats until the giveaway on the first Saturday in the month of December. And we'll certainly be giving away all during up to Christmas time the coats that we have left over. But we primarily want to get these coats to people who are in need. You can bring a coat, leave it here at the building, and so we'll have it on the first Saturday in the month of December. Well, we want new coats, or almost new coats, if you will. We don't want stuff you throwing out and throwing away, got holes in it and stuffing coming out of it and so forth. We don't want those. We want to give away stuff that we would want to receive on Christmas morning. So we're asking our members to either give financially to secure a winter coat for someone who is in need. We're in need of all sizes. We're primarily looking for sizes for children and for adults as well. So we need a variety of sizes, if you will, in this coat giveaway. And again, we want to thank Sister Jackson for coming up with this idea. And her idea was a fine Christian one, and it's also an opportunity. We're requesting that our young people get involved in this giveaway and to be present on the first Saturday in the month of December to give away these coats to those who are in need of coats. We're also asking for hats and gloves and boots so people will be prepared for the winter months. So we're asking for new coats, new boots, new hats, new gloves, so that people who need these items will have these items on the first Saturday, the book in the month of December. Also, we'll be sharing with you an idea that Sister Newsom came up with, and we certainly are going to be requesting your participation in this ministry. It's a wholesome ministry, it's a great ministry, and it will minister to those who are bedridden, those who are enclosed in their places of abode and unable to get out. We certainly will be able to get members to provide food for those who need items picked up from the grocery store. If you're shut in and in need of someone to get certain items for you, our church will provide that for you. And I want to thank Sister Newsom. Also, we will begin our bereavement ministry under the direction of Bishop Butler and Sister Sandra Butler, and I'm just elated that our members are coming up with ministries that will affect the lives of those who are around us, and that we can make God look good in our community. I see that my time is far spent. Beloved, it's far better to have God and not need him than to need God and not have him. If you walk with God, my God will walk with you. God bless you till we meet.